Well, welcome everyone to our webinar today from ABLEnet. Our topic today is how do I develop readiness for power mobility? My name is Michelle Lange. I'm an occupational therapist in the Denver, Colorado area, and I do work quite a bit with pediatric power mobility. I'm glad you could attend today, and I really hope that this information is helpful to you and to the clients that you serve. So with that, we're going to jump on into all this great information. So we're going to talk about how to develop readiness skills to successfully use a power wheelchair. That's what that PWC is. In our last webinar, if you were able to join us for that one, and if you were not, it is available in the ABLEnet library of recorded courses. We talked about how to determine if a child is ready yet for that power wheelchair evaluation. If the child was not quite ready for prime time, then we use pre-mobility training for a child that doesn't yet have their power chair to help them develop those readiness skills and then reevaluate. And the good news is we don't even need a power chair to do that. Now, I hear from team members, families all the time. They'll say, how in the world is my child going to learn how to drive a power chair if they don't have a power chair? We need one to practice with. We have to get one on loan. Not only that, we have to get one on loan that has the exact seating that this person needs and driving method. Well, that's a tall order. It's something that isn't typically going to happen. But again, fortunately, we have strategies that let us develop these skills even if we do not have a power wheelchair handy. So where does pre-mobility training fit in? Well, fortunately at this point, the client does not have to show mastery of these mobility concepts that we'll be discussing, only potential. When we see that potential, then we know it's time for that evaluation. It's not appropriate to expect a child to have mastery of each of those mobility concepts before they even try a power chair. That would be the same as us expecting a teenager to have mastered driving without driver's training. They need lots and lots of driver's training. In most states, 40 to 50 hours worth before they're even allowed to take a test. If the client is having difficulty with some of these mobility concepts, then pre-mobility training can be used to develop those concepts before we go ahead and do an assessment. Or if the assessment's been done and the child isn't quite ready, same thing, we can move in and determine which of these skills need some more work. And again, in our last webinar, we talked about what are those concepts, how do we measure them, how do we determine where more training might be needed. By doing this, we increase the likelihood of this child being successful in that power mobility evaluation. So in doing pre-mobility training, we can help develop skills in terms of motor skills, which are required to use the access or driving method, and cognitive skills, understanding the mobility concepts themselves. Now, most children are going to drive either using a joystick or using some type of switch combination. Switches are often used when the child is not able to use a joystick. Using a joystick is actually pretty tough for a lot of people to do. Switches can also be easier sometimes for our youngest kids because it's more concrete. A joystick allows movement in a 360-degree circle, and the farther you deflect the joystick from center, the faster the chair goes. That can be confusing for a very young child. If they're not pushing completely straight ahead, instead of going forward, they're going to veer to the side of it. And that child might have difficulty understanding why. Whereas if that child uses switches, if they push the forward switch, that's where the chair is going to go. If they push the left switch, that's where the chair is going to go, etc. So it's more concrete for those kids. Sometimes kids that have the potential to use a joystick will start with switches and move to a joystick later on. Part of the reason that joystick is hard to control is that we have to be able to balance muscle groups, flexors and extensors, like the muscles in our arms. We have to be able to grade the force of our movements and the distance of our movements. So some clients who have abnormal muscle tone will overshoot or undershoot the joystick. Or they might grab it with so much force that they can go forward, but they can't back off, pull it back just enough to make a turn. And that's why it can be difficult for some of our clients to use a joystick. So what can we do to develop some of these motor skills to use a joystick without actually having a power wheelchair? Well, we can hook up a joystick mouse like this one pictured here. We can hook this up either to a computer program or to a tablet. And we can use some various activities to help this child to practice with joystick movements. Now, using a joystick mouse to control a computer game like a painting program actually doesn't translate over very well to moving a power chair, to mobility concepts, but it does work well at developing motor skills, and so this can be a useful tool. That's our primary way of developing motor skills for joystick use. For switch skills, and again, we're going to use a variety of switches usually for driving, for forward, left, right, reverse. Sustained switch contact is required to keep the chair moving. If I press the switch down, the chair moves. As soon as I let go, that's how I stop. So we need to build the ability for sustained switch skills. This can be really important for some of our clients. I work with a lot of clients who perhaps are using switch scanning to control other assistive technologies, such as a communication device. And now we're asking them sometimes to use that same switch and switch location for sustained switch contact to control a power chair. That can take some practice to learn how to use the switch in a different manner. Now, there is a feature on power chairs called Latch, where I hit the switch one time and it's going to keep moving until I do something else. But Latch is something that we rarely use for children and new drivers because if I get distracted, I might run into something. So Latch is available. People might tell you, you don't need that sustained switch contact. You still really do for turns and usually for reverse. And again, there's some safety concerns. Latch is primarily used for people who are driving with sip and puff. It's very important that the client develop the ability to quickly and accurately release, let go of that switch to stop the power chair. So what can we do to build these skills? Well, we can use those good old school switch toys and other battery operated devices. So we connect a switch into, let me get my little arrow here. We connect a switch into either a pre-adapted battery operated toy, or we use these battery interrupters. We don't use anything in between like those switch latch and timers. This way, as long as the client is activating the switch, the toy is moving. As soon as they let go, the toy stops. And that's a way to start developing sustained switch contact. It's important to switch up the task so that the student doesn't get bored with a particular battery-operated toy, no matter how engaging they might be. We can also use the power link in direct mode, again, where sustained switch activation is required. So we're just providing practice, sustaining that switch contact. But now with electrical devices, we don't have to worry about batteries, and we have a wider variety of things we can hook up. Now, another skill that we can work on training is letting go of the switch, because again, that's how the client will stop. So at this point, we're not working again on doing this in a power chair. We're not working on the concept of stop and go. We're working on the motor skill. So we can develop activities or games that encourage the child to let go of that switch at a specific time. Keep it really positive. It's not a test. We don't want to over-therapeutize this child. We just want to play games. And one example, because I have a lot of clients who love train sets, and you can often get a train set pretty inexpensively, is hook up that train set transformer to a power link. Plug a switch in, use direct mode again, and as soon as the client lets go of the switch, the train will stop. We could put a little building somewhere and say, hey, let's deliver the mail to the post office, and the child can press the switch to make the train go. Hey, that's fun. Help develop sustained switch control, but they can then release the switch to stop the train at a certain time. So it's a motivating way, and you can certainly develop other activities as well. Hey, if you come up with some great ideas, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear about it. We can also use some other technology that includes these switch toys and power links and switch latch and timers. And this all falls under a category called electronic aids to daily living, particularly basic EADLs. Basic EADLs provide an alternative way of turning on and off battery-operated and electrical devices. Full-blown, full-function electronic aids to daily living provide a means of controlling all sorts of things in the environment, lights, audio-visual equipment, simple appliances. But these basic EADLs include switch-adapted battery toys, devices, switch latch and timers, such as this one here, and the power link. Some of this can be used to work on these skills as well. We have a no option that is nice to add to our toolbox. We really have to keep these little people's attention, and it's nice to have other options. This is called Loons, and it's an app that you can get for free on your tablet. And it allows the client to play games through their driving method. So let's say you're working with a client who already has a power chair. Well, they can use their driving method as long as it is a Stealth Products iDrive driving method. They can use that to play this game, and the hope is to develop more games eventually, and children will be able to play with each other even across the country. But this is the first step, is this initial game, Loons. So why am I bringing this up? Because there's an option now through Stealth to take one of their driving methods, such as this head array, a common alternative driving method, hook it up to a power pack so that now you don't need a power chair at all. You could mount this on a child's adaptive stroller or their manual chair, wherever they're already well positioned. And as the child moves their head between these various switches or uses another iDrive driving method, they can control this game, Loons. Loons is about an elephant who is in the jungle and moving around in a hot air balloon, and it helps teach a child how to move in various directions and avoid different hazards. So it's a fun game, but it's also specifically developed to design some power wheelchair driver training. So we're going to take a look at a brief video, a very brief video, of a young man who is playing with Loons. And I'm going to play that one more time because it is a very brief video. So this young man already has a power wheelchair, and he happens to be using an iDrive mini proportional joystick, and he is moving through these various levels of the game. All right. I want to let you know that as we move through this information, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type those into the question box at any time, and I will be stopping periodically to answer those, and we should have enough time at the end to answer questions as well. So when we're looking at developing motor skills, the goal at that point of pre-mobility training is to simply do that, develop motor skills. The skills do not have to be perfect to move forward, and a lot of clients are also going to need training to develop mobility concepts, more of those cognitive skills. Some clients are not going to require this training at all. I'm always very happy when that happens. I have some clients that just hop in and take off. Great, we pick out colors. But some clients are going to need this training. Sometimes we have to really break down the task into baby steps so the client can eventually be functional using a power wheelchair. It might take time, but better to get started now if it's going to take a long time so the client can eventually have that functional mobility. All right, so I'm going to stop for a second to see if anyone has any questions before we move into developing cognitive skills, understanding those mobility concepts. All right, I'm not seeing any questions or comments yet. That is fine. I know this group always has a lot of awesome conversation, but you might still be typing. So if you're still typing, please continue, and I will pick up those questions in just a few minutes. Okay, so next we're going to talk about developing those cognitive skills. So again, we're talking about a student who does not yet have a power chair, or perhaps does, but has never been successful driving it. This client is not quite ready for that power wheelchair evaluation, or maybe had one and showed that they weren't quite ready yet. We've worked on developing the necessary motor skills, but now we need to develop the cognitive skills, the understanding of the following mobility concepts: cause and effect, stop and go, directional concepts, and problem solving. And again, try to get all that done without a power chair. Now, we talked about these mobility concepts in detail in How Do I Know a Child's Ready for Power Mobility? And again, this is on a recorded webinar through AbleNet, and I put the link here, but you can find that under recorded webinars under resources on their website. But let's quickly review these mobility concepts. Cause and effect is really the most basic, and a child really does require this concept to be successful in their mobility, and that's realizing that activating the access method, whether it's a joystick or switches, is causing movement of the power chair. If the child does not understand that they're directly controlling this, we've got a problem, and we need to work on that. We can measure this through a verbal response, but also nonverbal. It's usually fairly apparent that the child recognizes, wow, I'm moving, I did that. Stop and go concepts is the client realizing that activating the access method moves the power chair. Releasing the activating access method stops that movement. It's really just a step up from cause and effect. We can measure this through a verbal response and also whether the client is following some directions for stop and go. It's not always the case that the clients I work with want to listen to me, but I do want to see that if possible. And then are they attempting to stop for obstacles? At this point, this does not require accuracy. I'm not looking for a client to drive up to a location and stop before they collide with it. I want to know, are they understanding the concept? We can work on accuracy later. Directional concepts, also important. Does the client realize that the power wheelchair will move in different directions depending on either how the joystick is moved or on which switch is activated? Again, we can measure this by how the client responds either verbally or non-verbally to different movement caused by different input of the joystick or the switches, or if they attempt to move to a location using these different directional commands. Problem solving is where I find that a lot of clients need some extra support in order to be successful with their mobility. The client needs to demonstrate developmentally appropriate. Now, I do not say age appropriate, more developmentally appropriate for that individual. Do they show that problem solving during their driving? And what this really means is that if I need to get from point A to point B, and that is not a straight line, I need to execute a series of joystick movements for a discrete period of time, each movement, or switch activations, various switch activations for a certain period of time to get from point A to point B. That's really challenging. And so we want to see if this client understands that basic problem solving and mobility. So let's say we're working with a client and maybe they don't quite have those mobility concepts. How do we train those? There's two main methods I like to use. And I do actually see clients, so you can, believe me, I use these all the time myself. We can use these basic EADLs like switch toys, like switch latch and timers, like power links to develop specific cognitive skills. What I also use quite a bit, and it's being shown in this picture here, is we use a dependent mobility base to simulate movement of a power wheelchair. No power wheelchair is required. And if we use them both together, we can increase learning. So basically what I'm doing in this picture is when Colton hits a switch, I move the chair. If he activates a switch that's designated as, quote, forward, I move the chair forward. It's a real easy way of starting to determine if Colton is understanding these concepts to help him practice these concepts, and I can do it all in his current mobility base in his current seating. So let's talk about each of these methods. First is cause and effect. So method number one, cause and effect, is either using switch toys. I'll get my little arrow again. We have a resurgence of popularity of Toy Story right now. PowerLink in direct mode, because we're simulating the type of switch access that's required for using a power chair, that sustained switch access. The cause is pressing the switch. The effect, toy and device activation. Now, some of the clients we work with do not yet have cause and effect and might need to hang out in this area for a while. There's a number of strategies we can use, high and low tech, to help start developing cause and effect. If the client is really struggling with cause and effect, they will not be able to use a power chair because they simply are not understanding this. But remember, there are some clients that might look like they don't understand cause and effect. They might be bored. They may not want to play. It's really important to bring in motivating activities, vary those activities, and convince this client sometimes that they really are controlling something. There are times where I think some of the children I work with are so used to someone else controlling things for them that even if they push that switch, even if that chair moves forward or that toy activates, it might take them a while to really believe that someone isn't behind them secretly pushing their own switch or controlling the device themselves. It can take someone who maybe has developed some of that learned helplessness a while to be convinced that this is really something that they can do, that they're capable of. Direct control requires sustained switch activation in order to continue activation of the battery-operated or electrical device. So these basic EADLs, these switch latch and timers, or power links may offer direct control, timed control, or latch control. We want to use direct. Switch release is going to result in the device stopping. So whatever's plugged into that switch, a battery-operated toy, is going to stop when the switch is released. This is similar to power wheelchair control. Sustained switch contact is required to continue wheelchair movement, and then switch release is going to stop the chair. Latch control. We can use latch, but again, typically we're not going to do so with children and new drivers in power wheelchair access. In latch, this requires a momentary switch activation rather than sustain. So I push down the switch and let go. The device turns on. It's going to continue to be activated until I push the switch a second time and release, and that's going to stop it. But again, this can be a safety issue in children. All right. So we've talked about cause and effect. The next mobility concept is stop and go. We can again hit this two different ways, and that's using these low-tech options, basic EADLs, and then simulating this with a manual wheelchair or adaptive stroller, any mobility base. So in this case, we can use switch toys with a direct connection, a power link in direct mode, a switch latch and timer such as this with latch mode activated, or power link in latch mode. Switch activation is like go. Switch release is like stop. In latch mode, the first switch activation is go, and the second switch activation is stop. Now that sounds a lot like cause and effect, doesn't it? But cause and effect means the client realizes, hey, I did something and something happened. Stop and go is just a baby step above that, and some clients do need this task broken down to this extent. The client realizes they can both start and stop their movement. So let's talk about method 2. We don't really use method 2 for cause and effect, but it works well for stop and go. So if the child is already in an adaptive stroller or manual chair, we can place a switch, or you could even, if you don't have switches, use like a colored paper circle that you put on a tray, for example, if the client can access it in that location. It's not plugged into anything, even if it's a switch. When the child presses the switch, you push the mobility base. When the child releases the switch, you stop pushing. So we just have to use one switch. It can be mounted wherever the client has control. In this picture, Colton is using one by the left side of his head. I do explain to the child that this is what we're going to be doing with this. We're going to, that I'm going to put this switch in this location. When you touch this switch, I'm going to move the chair. I'm going to be your motor. Occasionally, I run into a kiddo who doesn't want to play this game, and we might have a conversation that we're just practicing. This will help him get ready for a power wheelchair. Let's just give this a try. I think this will make more sense if we actually watch. So we're going to look at a series of 3 videos where Colton is activating a switch and I'm pushing the wheelchair. He lets go and I stop. And then I believe in our 3rd video, he is trying 2 switches. One of those switches is going to move him forward, and the other is going to turn him in a specific direction.
Let's go. There you go. Good job. Let's do it again. Well, yeah.
Wow, now what do we do?
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to help you for a minute. We're going to hold it. It's different than what you do talking.
All right, so there, Colton was moving the chair. He needs some time to realize, hey, this is how this game is working. This is what's doing. I actually cued him a bit by moving his head towards the switch to show him this is how it works. I do try to provide some very basic auditory cues. Thank you, Jennifer, for asking about that, where I might say, in response to a child hitting the switch, go. When they let go, stop. Otherwise, I don't provide very much dialogue, even though I'm talking you guys to death today. When I'm working with small children, I usually use very simple vocabulary, simple cues to give the child time to process. Let's look at the next video.
Moved. Hold it down. There you go. Your ear's kind of stuck on it, huh? There you go. Stop.
So here he's starting to understand more. He's pushing that switch. He's stopping, and he was actually stopping before he reached obstacles on his own. He was working very, very hard and still trying to figure this out. This is where those universal switch mounts come in handy. I often will use 3 jelly bean switches and some universal switch mounts because I can put it on the mobility base and easily move those wherever the client might have the most control. Now, Colton was already using the left side of his head to scan on a communication device, so he's used to having a switch there, but he's used to using it in a very different way. He hits the switch, a scan starts, he hits the switch again when he hears what he wants to say. For driving, he has to hit the switch, hold it down, and let go to stop. So this was a bit of a learning curve for him. Sometimes it's hard for me to tell if the student has completely come off the switch or even if they've completely activated it. So another trick that I do is AbleNet also sells switch testers. And I actually have on a universal mount a large metal plate with 3 switch testers on it. I need to take a picture of it sometime and put it in here. And I plug each switch into it so I can be behind the client and I can tell for sure if they're on the switch or not. Let's look at one more video.
Come see Mom. There you go. He's so used to hitting that switch and letting go, it's going to take some practice to hold it down. But he sure knows what he's doing.
All right, come here, sweetie. Come to Mama.
Good job. You were listening. Look at you holding down that switch. A little more. You're touching it. Just give it a little push. There you go.
So we still have just one switch at this point. I do have another video, but I'm not sure if it's in this particular presentation here where we've added a second one for turns. But you can see that Colton's starting to get this down. He's understanding more and more, okay, I've got this, I'm controlling this. I hit the switch, I go, this is how I stop. So our goal is to develop the concept of stop and go. I'm not looking for the client to stop accurately at this point, but I want them to understand the concept. Okay, so Jennifer had asked a question about where the switches are placed and how he activated them, and in the video you could see that at this point he had a switch by the left side of his head. We eventually, because since this evaluation or this training time with Colton, have recommended a power wheelchair for him, he's actually going to be driving with switches on either side of his head and a switch by his right hand. He has been developing some better skills in his hand more recently, and the hand will be forward and left and right will be up by his head. And Elizabeth has asked, when using head-mounted switches, what do you recommend starting with? We have been using a unilateral mounted pillow switch, but wanted to start introducing one on the other side. What options are there? when the student has inconsistent head control? Well, first off, Elizabeth, what I would recommend is there is a webinar that I've done that's in the AbleNet library on determining the very best spot for a switch, and there's another one on choosing the best type of switch, because it's a big question, and of course it depends quite a bit on that individual client. So the first step is determining, is this the very best spot for a switch? From there, I'll determine the type of switch based somewhat on how much force the client has and how much feedback they need. For example, a lot of people drive with a head array. It has proximity switches built in. But sometimes for training purposes, or even for a younger person who might need a little more feedback, there's no feedback from those proximity switches, where mechanical switches have a nice click to let someone know, yep, I got it. So I sometimes will use mechanical switches for that purpose. And then finally, the other thing I would add in is I'm not a big fan of pillow switches. The reason is the purpose of a pillow switch is to encase the switch in a nice soft container so that if you hit it with some force, you won't hurt yourself. What I find is there's the opposite issue where clients will really smash into that switch because it's the only way they can activate it. So I tend to use a more sensitive switch and encourage that client that they do not have to use a lot of force to activate it. So I often start with a jelly bean just because it's a nice size and sensitivity level for evaluation. And then I'll move from there and decide which is the best permanent switch. Another switch I often use by the side of the head because it's a nice size is the AbleNet spec switch as well. And if force is an issue, I might use a microlight switch. I hope that is helpful. All right, directional concepts. So again, directional concepts is understanding that depending on how I move the joystick or which switch I hit, I'm going to move in a different direction. So we can train this using our first method of these low technology devices, and we can hook up 3 devices with 3 switches. It'll reinforce for the client that each switch has a different function. It's not yet reinforcing directions. It's just reinforcing each of these switches has a different job to do. What if the client's going to use a joystick? Well, this is still going to help start developing directional concepts. Using our second method, where you're the motor, you're moving that child's mobility base. Place 3 switches where the child can access them. Make sure you tell them what you're doing and how this is going to work. And then move the chair in the corresponding direction when the child activates the switch. Now, I will usually start with 1 switch for forward. Then I add a second as I feel the child's ready for a turn. And then I'll add a third for turning in the other direction. And actually, I see, sorry for my poor memory here, I do have another video of Colton coming up where you'll see him using more than 1 switch. Now, what about that joystick? Well, if the client is going to use a joystick, we can still use switches to work on these directional concepts. It's easier to use switches on a manual mobility base. Even if you had a joystick that you could perhaps put on that manual mobility base somehow, it's really hard to tell exactly where the client's moving this thing and how hard. So I'll usually use switches at this point, and then if they're able to use a joystick, fine, we've been working on these concepts. Next is in our directional concepts, we can also utilize some other strategy. So while someone is pushing this mobility base, or even when the child is riding in the car, I encourage the parents who are driving to just verbalize the direction of movement. A lot of these kiddos are not yet familiar with terms like left and right. Some of us adults have difficulty with that as well. And I want them to hear some consistent vocabulary. So I will really encourage, and caregivers often get in a really good habit whenever they're moving the child of saying, go, stop, I'm going straight, I'm turning left, I'm turning right. We can also play games while we're using switches on that manual mobility base, like follow the leader. Follow the leader is an old school game, but kids still love it, and it's great for this, where if you have someone who's willing to move really slow, you can have the client attempt to follow them by pushing the switches. And it's usually more engaging than me simply saying, go over there. Okay, so let's see Colton again. Oh, and I thought I had a video here. In this picture here, we have Colton has a switch here on the left that we've seen before, and he's using this for forward, but now we've added a switch to the right side, and he is turning. He's turning towards the wall. Now, when I'm using the second method, I will absolutely let the child run into the wall. Now, I don't smash their chair into the wall. I don't want to cause property damage to this pretty wall here, but also I don't want to scare the child, and I certainly don't want to injure them. I'll bump the wall, and I'll redirect them. If they continue to hit that switch, I'll continue to turn gently into the wall and say, we can't go that way. We need another direction, and I'll help them correct their course. Our goal with directional concepts is to develop the concept that specific joystick movements or sequence of switch activations are going to move the wheelchair where we want to go. The client does not need to drive from point A to point B accurately at this time, and it is not uncommon for kids to take the very, very long scenic route to get from point A to point B. But I don't mind, because every time they're hitting the switch, they are learning. Kids learn very well by trial and error. All right. Our final mobility concept that requires some of this pre-mobility training is problem solving. And we can touch on this using these two methods as well. So first we can use a switch latch and timer. That's this SLAT acronym here. This particular one is called the dual switch latch and timer. And you can plug in two switches and two devices. The first switch activates one device. The second switch activates another device. The client has to determine which switch to hit and when. We're starting to develop that problem solving. If I've hit this yellow switch and made these battery-operated scissors go, this point sorter won't work until these are done, until the time has run out that I have set. Now I can hit the second switch. So it starts developing some problem solving. There's the correct switch to hit at the correct time. Again, we're really hitting this at a conceptual level. Using our second method, we can again place three switches wherever the child can activate them. This young man happened to be trying to activate switches with his left foot. Again, tell the client what you're doing. And then when they activate that switch, move the mobility base in that direction. Then, since we're working on problem solving, and we have multiple switches at this point, we want to encourage the child to drive to a specific location. And again, not worry too much if they take the scenic route. We can build in some games to this too. It's important to give the child time to explore. An ideal setting is a really big empty space, like a gym when everyone else is in math class. Just give this child a chance to explore. Again, kids learn best with trial and error and not a lot of verbal command. We can play games like hide and seek, as long as the person who's hiding is not hiding very well and is infinitely patient. It might take this client a long time to get over there, but again, every time they hit the switch, even if they go in the wrong direction, if they hit a switch that's moving them away from their goal, push the chair in that direction. That's the switch they hit. And they'll let go and say, oh, wait a minute, that's not where I wanted to go. And they're learning. Our goal is to develop the ability to determine the necessary combination of switches or joystick movements to get from one location to another. So it takes time. And again, every time your client hits that switch, they are learning. We do have another new option. There is a system out now, and this is also from Stealth Products, that's virtual reality. And it allows someone to experience driving without actually moving at all. You can use these virtual reality goggles in somebody's manual mobility base. It's hooked up to a specialized computer system, and the client drives virtually through a number of environments without actually driving at all. So again, power chair isn't required. We don't have to worry about having huge spaces or room for equipment, etc. It's just something that this person can experience virtually. Now, with that said, I have found that some clients, myself included, need some time to accommodate to these goggles. You can actually experience a little bit of motion sickness. So one thing that we've learned over time with trying some virtual reality with clients is if we put the goggles on someone's head and not start the program, not allow them to virtually move for a good few minutes, just let them look around, that helps to reduce chances of any motion sickness. If the client cannot tolerate wearing the goggles, doesn't want to wear them, maybe it feels kind of scary for them, or they do have motion sickness, we can take the goggles off and place them on the desk. And now the client can simply look at the computer screen. And as they move, we can move the scene for them. So they still get a sense of the virtual movement without having to wear the goggles. So let's look at a video of this.
Visually, it was very like teaching me like what it might be like, and it's interesting the effects afterwards. You know, so I got out of the chair and kind of sensed my body a little differently, and so yeah, I like that.
Do you think it's practical? Do you think it's something that's going to be used and it could be great in the training aspect of using like a powered mobility device?
I think it's a neat idea for people to see what's possible for their patients. So you could easily use it and then start to see if this.
Okay, and I think that video might have been looping. So that gives you a sense of one of the scenes. One of the scenes there is a gymnasium. And as you look around, you can visually scan the environment. And as you move the driving method, in this case, she was holding something called a mushroom joystick at her hand. As she moves that, the scene changes. She is virtually moving through the scene. And again, if she couldn't tolerate wearing the goggles for some reason, she could move the driving method, and the screen, that big screen that Gabriel Romero is looking at, who is one of the vice presidents at Stealth, will change. And so that's another way of using this. Okay. So if you have questions, I've allowed for a chunk of time here at the end for questions. While people are typing those in, I just want to review a couple things, and then we'll go back to questions. So our take-home message today is this. Some kids, adults too, hop in a power chair and start driving right away. Yay, I love those days, especially if it's a Monday morning. But other children need time. They need training to develop the skills that are required, both motor and cognitive mobility concepts, prior to that power wheelchair assessment or perhaps reassessment. There are a lot of strategies that we can use to develop readiness, all the way from battery-operated toys through virtual reality and a number of things in between. Fortunately, we have a lot of options that do not require a power wheelchair so we can still continue to work on these skills. Make sure, if you have time, that you make a note. Our next webinar in this series on power and mobility is how do I train a child who already has that power chair to be a better driver? And we're going to talk about that on November 19th. So I hope you can join me then. And on my website are some pre-mobility training guidelines. Feel free to download those and use them if they're helpful. My website's listed here, atilange.com, and this is under resources. There's some other resources there as well. Feel free to grab those. And again, before those questions, I want to thank you very much for participating in the webinar here today. I know everyone's super busy, but I do hope that this information is helpful to you. And make sure you have my contact information. Phew, so we got through all that information and actually have time left for questions, so feel free to type those in. If you have any comments or other suggestions of things you've tried to meet these needs that have been successful, feel free to pop those in as well. And while people are typing things in, I know one of the most common questions I get, no matter what we discuss, is funding. If you are in a situation where you are billing each time you're seeing a child, say in private practice or in hospital setting, clinics, this is something definitely that you can train for. There is a wheelchair training code that we can use, or other codes as well, as appropriate, to address this, and our goals are quite clear. We're trying to develop mobility concepts and ready this person to use a power wheelchair so they can be more independent in their mobility. So this is absolutely something we can do. Because all of us have limited time, what I will often do is start off the pre-mobility training process, and then I will pass on that baton to someone else to continue training and check in with them periodically. So that might be the family, could be someone at the school setting, someone who can continue this process. It's important to make sure the client doesn't get stuck, though, and I might need to keep intervening periodically to keep them moving along. Patricia's asked, can these suggestions be used for adults also? Absolutely. Of course, depending on the activities we're choosing, we're just going to change the activities or the motivation to be a little more age appropriate. So instead of using the stuffed pink pig walking across the table with a switch, we might choose to hook something into that power link instead. That might be more appropriate. But yes, a lot of these concepts can be used with all ages. Even though Loons is kind of a fun game for kids, I know adults who enjoy playing it too, and the virtual reality is fairly age neutral. If anything, I think the virtual reality sometimes is a little sterile for very young children, and adults tend to be a little more motivated by it. Elizabeth has asked, are there any switch apps you recommend to work on pre-mobility skills? Really, the only one out there that's designed to try to work more on a mobility skill is Loons. There are a lot of cool switch apps out there, and I actually recorded a webinar on apps that can be used to train switch skills, and that can certainly be helpful to work on motor skills, but they don't generally work on mobility concepts. And some research that was done quite a number of years ago found that when you have kind of a two-dimensional activity, it doesn't translate over very well to a very multi-sensory activity like driving a power chair. that's one of the reasons why there's been some recent work in virtual reality, is because virtual reality is so immersive, it tends to translate over to that task of power wheelchair driving that really does feel like you're moving. Tricia asked, I was late. You were late, Patricia. I'm so sorry. If you want to catch the beginning of this, feel free to watch it on the recorded version soon. But she wants to know where I can find info on Loons. The Loons app is available in the App Store, and Loons is developed by Stealth Products. It will not work with just any switch plugged into it at this point. It will only work with a Stealth Products power wheelchair driving method. So if someone's already using a power chair and they're using a Stealth Products driving method, if you're not sure if they are, you can ask the family, ask the supplier if they know if that is a driving method from Stealth. They can use Loons. If, as we're talking about pre-mobility, this client doesn't have a power chair yet, you can take an iDrive, Stealth Products iDrive driving method, like their head array, for example. There is a battery pack available for it, and that iDrive, which is Bluetooth enabled, will connect to the tablet and allow the client to interact with Loons. It's a way of letting someone practice with the driving method even if they don't have a power chair. Now, you may not have an iDrive driving method and battery pack in your back pocket. That's okay. You can contact Stealth Products. You might have a representative, most likely you do in your area, that might be able to get you one to try out so that you can use it with a client. All right, we just have a few minutes left, so if you have a question or comment, this is a great time to type it on in there. And thank you, Elizabeth and Jennifer, for your comments. Again, I really do hope this is helpful, because all this information is only helpful if we all go out there and try it out with our clients. And heaven knows we could always use some more strategies. We can work with some tough clients, and we need all the help we can get to help them gain more function and independence. And mobility is definitely a big one. And as we're wrapping up, since I'm not seeing any more questions right now, again, one of the things I really like about these strategies is, like you, I hear from many, many parents particularly who will say, what do you mean my child isn't ready for a power chair? They'll never learn unless we get a power chair. Why won't someone buy them a power chair? I know if they have one, they'll learn how to do this. But we do need to at least demonstrate some potential when we're writing those letters of medical necessity for a power chair. And it's important that we have some information. And sometimes pre-mobility training is required, not all the time. And it's nice to have some strategies where we can assure team members, including families, that we are working on this and it will be helpful. We just aren't using a power wheelchair. And we're getting that child ready to reevaluate or evaluate for the first time for power mobility so that they can be successful. It's better to slow it down and break up the task and have this child be successful than to rush it through and have it not work. Or even if we acquire a power chair, we certainly don't want it sitting in someone's garage. want this person to successfully be able to use it. And that can really be due to training. So again, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it very much, and I hope that we see you at the next AbleNet webinar.